All right, I'm sitting down with Hayden Rieveschl, who's out of Cincinnati. We met through a mutual friend named Bill Fowler. We hung out at Riso, the last Riso down in Florida, and had a lot of fun together, and now friends. We hang out outside of the context of work and just talk about life, but we also talk a lot about the discussion we're going to have today, which is, how do you deal with the MLS network as a entrepreneur trying to break your way into this space without any previous serious experience? We're outsiders. Welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. Great to be here.
Yeah, this is gonna be a cool series. You and I connected at Riso, and Bill connected us right before that. But since then, you and I have been talking a lot about, how do we do a better job breaking into this space, and also how do we help others. I think you and I are going through the same process and realizing that there's a lot of barriers, there's a lot of
hmm
gatekeepers, challenges, and I think we've been navigating them well with the help of people like Bill Fowler. But part of this
hmm
series is how do we get MLS executives and founders like ourselves closer together and have a dialogue. So this series is going to be with entrepreneurs, MLS execs, and we're going to have conversations that I think you and I have experienced or typically having behind or being had behind closed doors, which is
hmm
frustrating because the only way that we can learn is by getting behind those doors, and that's not how innovation happens. We got to open stuff up. Um,
Absolutely.
so before we dive into too deep here, go over your background leading up to Ocusell, where you're living,
hmm
and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, graduated from SMU as a, finance major. Ended up, getting into the oil and gas business naturally in Texas. And Worked for a hedge fund for about 8 months before I peeled off and started doing my own thing. Mineral and royalty acquisition, set up a number of funds over the course of about 10 years. But, real estate had always been, a part of my life, my family's life. So something that, I knew a lot about. There's a lot of knowledge there, but, I was also really interested into getting into a different space. Towards the end of those 10 years, I made some small investments in some different companies, but one of those companies was a visual media company that serviced residential agents and brokers. And that was my window into, well, the listing process, more or less, right? Which kind of gave way to, right, the idea for Ocusell, just witnessing the chaos, especially when they're dealing with multiple MLSs, the archaic systems that they were using, right, to publish properties and update properties. Um, there's just a clear opportunity there. So
Yeah, what
that's the
in
background.
in like two sentences, what's the acute pain point you noticed agents or brokers were having related to the listing process that you got the inside look into?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, MLS systems were single user interfaces. The listing process was not a single user process. There were lots of different people involved, and there was no sort of collaborative platform to streamline that process. Not to mention that, just the archaic nature of those systems. So in working right with residential agents, mainly on the visual media side, um, it was content was all over the place. Not to mention they were using archaic systems. So it all just made for a very complicated process, and it didn't have to be. And then on top of that, right, most of these brokers in the area that I was working in Florida specifically, were dealing with multiple MLSs, and they were using multiple archaic systems to get their properties listed. Um, it was it was a lot of hoops that they had to jump through for no reason. So
Yeah, and then take that and kind of seamlessly give the elevator pitch from that. So got the problem now. Now give us the quick elevator pitch, and as this goes on, we'll dive way deeper into OcuSell.
yep, yep. On average, brokers, are members of two plus MLSs. It can take them significant amount of time, right, to list a property, involving, their agents, the staff, marketing coordinators. We developed a platform enterprise listing solution to streamline the entirety of that process and serve as a bridge to multiple MLSs, of which they're members.
Nice. So you had this insight, realized the problem, figured out some ways to solve it or what that solution might look like. What were some of your first steps? Because I think this is where, looking back in my own company, I might have done things a little bit differently. Building the way I built the company, the way that I approached the market. What were some of your first moves once you kind of had this idea, this product, and something you wanted to tackle the market with?
Absolutely. So my first moves were naturally is, who are we, like we're selling this to brokers, right? So let's go sit down, with brokers. And, at the time it was brokers from all over the country. Do you have this problem, really was my question, more vetting, the idea more than anything. So that was apparent, really. Anywhere that I talked to a broker, that was certainly apparent. I knew some folks in the real estate space, so they put me in touch with brokers, from coast to coast. Um, then when it really came down to, all right, hands-on development, it was, working with brokers here in Cincinnati to truly understand, all right, if we are developing this platform, right, what are the features, functionality, how does this flow, to really choreograph that for me. And what we had to do is it's a nonlinear process, right? All brokerages have their own process and their own way of doing things. So we had to make a platform that was pretty malleable in that sense. So those were my first steps. Um, Looking back, those were good first steps, but I probably should have simultaneously been, starting conversations with the MLS because I had
Yeah.
no idea that this would take
Yeah.
so long.
Yeah. And we're having this podcast because we're both in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're a little further behind you as far as integrations into MLSs, but I had the same realization. We with Simba, we took our product to market, vetted it, understood there was a pain point we were solving with agents. Um, Looking back, I wish again, alongside of that, talking to MLSs, and in hindsight, that's something I would have definitely put way more focus on that now I'm having to. And it's a little more stressful now because
Yeah.
as a startup founder, you got runway, you got to invest, you got to raise investment dollars, and these MLSs take a long time to get in the door. And frankly, I had to pay somebody to get in the door, like Bill
Yeah.
Fowler, and I'd love to hear your
Oh,
experience on how you did this as well. But for Simba, it's pay to play, and it feels pay to play. I didn't like that, but I had to do it. We've made great headway. But what was that experience for you, mainly with Cincinnati? But how have you expanded beyond Cincinnati to start talking to other
right.
MLSs?
Right. And I mean, for us right now, it's very much pay to play. As you mentioned in the beginning, Bill is Bill is in both of our lives. That's how we got connected. Great guy, by the way. Um, but initially I didn't have the network that I do today. So I wasn't pulling in somebody to make that warm introduction. I was physically going to the Cincinnati MLS, knocking on their door, uh, pretty much begging for time, just to sit down and talk with them. I mean, of course, emails, calls, um, getting those answered, initially was pretty non-existent, let's say. They, didn't have any interest in talking to somebody, with an idea, although we were in product development. So it was a year, I'd say, of sort of bothering them, until I finally got a sit down meeting with them. And at that point, we had a product. It was a beta version of the product, but a product nonetheless. And once they saw that, the doors did open. They explained to me like, look, if you want to expedite this, right, get a broker sponsor. So we had many brokers in town that were behind this and saw the value. But yeah, I mean, it was, like I said, a year in startup land. I mean, that could kill your
Yeah,
business. Luckily, like,
yeah,
we had raised, enough, not necessarily anticipating, this massive obstacle and all the hoops that we had to jump through, but, we were okay. Now, subsequently had to raise a lot more money just because of the time that it took, right, to get into these various MLSs.
Do you feel like MLS executives understand this and have empathy for founders? Do you feel like that's there, or are they largely blind to it because they're just focused on what they've got to do day to day and they've got a lot of projects? Do you feel like there is this sense of understanding and empathy towards founders? I'll tell you my
I
personal experience being at Reso.
hmm
It's kind of hit or miss.
Yep.
It feels like some of them have an understanding because maybe they have done more MLS deals with technology providers, and then there's others that are much more closed off. They have zero
hmm
understanding, and they don't understand our timelines. That it's do or die. So, what was your perspective? Because for me, it was kind of frustrating and hit or miss.
Right. Yeah, and I completely agree with that sentiment. I mean, it's definitely hit or miss. Now, when we're talking about, my first conversation, zero empathy whatsoever. Um, I mean, it was all right, if you want to do this, here's what we need. We'll get you started. And uh, it, I mean, very hands off, very just like, here you go, do what you do. Let us know when you complete the integration.
Yeah,
There weren't many questions that we could ask. The documentation was outdated, so it was a lot of us figuring it out. And I think, again, like a lot of MLS executives are very focused on, at the end of the day, appeasing their board, right? I mean, and I totally get that. And they have a lot thrown at them every day. A lot of them are strapped for resources. But yeah, at Reso, I certainly met, a lot of executives as well that I think, had a certain amount of empathy. Now, have they ever sort of, walked in our shoes? I don't think so. But there are definitely some out there that do and that have.
yeah. Okay, so you get access to Cincinnati. They say, okay, here's an integration documentation drop, zip file, whatever it is.
hmm
Then what? So give us that experience from your first integration, and maybe advice you have for other founders on that front when you're dealing with your first integration.
Yeah, I mean, classically, right? If someone has an API, typically, they have updated documentation. It shouldn't be, months and months of integration and trying to figure out what's missing and why isn't this working, and wait, these, business and validation rules that, are supposed to be embedded in the system are actually not, they don't mirror the policy they're supposed to represent. um, I mean, it, we fixed so much along the way and had to figure it out. So in terms of the advice, going back, I mean, try to put yourself in a position where you're speaking with, a more progressive, innovative MLS, right? Ask lots of questions, because more progressive, innovative MLSs, and granted, Cincy is definitely turning a corner, and I think their behavior is changing. And this is nothing against the folks that are working over there. I just think, some of these folks are just a little late to the party. So, my advice would be, yeah, do your research, because in our mind it was, oh, it's an MLS, right? It's, they're all the same. That's not true.
Yeah,
Um, and make sure that they have the proper documentation. That there aren't any unanswered questions leading into to that integration. I know speed is essential, but yeah, do the due diligence on the front end, which, to our credit, we thought we had done. We thought, well, if they're offering this API, it should be, up to date and things are working. And come to find out, there really wasn't anyone using that API. So it was up to us to fix all of the problems and issues with it.
yeah, yeah. I'd love to see more of a developer centric um, kind of aura around some of these MLSs. In the developer space, we build products. So at Simba, we're a fintech company, and we deal a lot with APIs and a lot of these fintech APIs. And you've got Stripe, you've got Plaid, and you've got some of these
Right.
amazing developer focused companies. That is in reality where MLSs need to find themselves on the tech side, is really
Yep.
having built out documentation, really having built out support teams that are there for the developers. I think that's really where we need to move towards. And I think you guys are going to really play a big part in that. And so as we go through the podcast, let's continue to dive into that. So I think that's where this
Yep.
conversation is going to trend. Um, but
Hmm.
on that front, this is something I'm curious about is when you start to integrate these MLSs, do you need developers that are knowledgeable and have experience in this space, or can you rip a developer from a traditional SaaS company and say, "Hey, join my company, let's go integrate with an MLS"? Or are you going to have to pull somebody that has experience, industry experience, MLS experience to get this done? What's been your learning there?
Right. Well, I mean, we were lucky to have an MLS, a developer rather, that was pretty proficient in MLS integrations. Um, there are not a lot of them out there. If they are out there, they're working for, some of the big MLS vendors, your CoreLogic, your Flexes. Um, not too many independent contractors with that sort of knowledge. So no, you can't just pluck some, senior developer from a SaaS company, put them at the helm of an MLS integration and expect them to just rip through it, because they're not going to. I mean, there's a lot of acquired knowledge that needs to happen, just in terms of, real estate, right? I mean, because you're dealing with field mappings, you're dealing with data schema that is very unique to the space and to the MLS.
Yeah, makes sense. And you guys have a particularly more complicated integration here, read write. Uh, Tell us what that means. Why are MLSs a little bit more protective of that? What's your experience been there? And pass on some wisdom to founders that might want to do the same in the future.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is more complicated. It involves, right, not only, reading the data on that specific MLS system, but being able to publish data and update data within that MLS system. So it's a two-way street. Um, what was the second part to your question, Evan?
Just yeah, learnings there,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
taking what you've learned and passing on to other founders that might need read write. What makes it difficult in particular that maybe you can streamline for others?
Absolutely. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think your architecture is extremely important, because if you are developing, an ad edit tool, or even the semblance of an ad edit tool, maybe they're only updating specific things in the system. Um, you need to have data standardization, right? I mean, that's incredibly important, right? The architecture in which you build your system is incredibly important, because what you don't want to do is try to filter through data on their side. You really have to ingest that data, filter through it on your side. It's the only way this thing is going to work. Um, so, you know, we ultimately, pulled in some known entities in terms of engineering talent within the industry, because it was even outside of, our senior developer's purview. He, knew enough to be dangerous. He understood, the real estate space, especially as it applies to the MLS. But when it comes to the system's architecture needed to interface with an MLS system, that was not so much. He didn't understand that quite as much. So we ended up pulling somebody else in. So I think, it's really about, as fast as I know, you need to run. It's about taking that step back and saying, all right, where are we lacking in terms of, our resources, our skill sets, because you want to pull in, knowledgeable resources to help you tackle, a project like this.
Yeah. And I think, for me personally, when we were starting Simba, kind of the arc of learning for me was my co founder is a realtor, dealt with the
Hmm.
problem we're solving. Financial literacy, financial wellness for agents is very difficult. So we found a very acute pain point, started building the product. And at that point, I was trying to figure out, as we were building this product, best ways to take it to market. So I had, a long period of learning, reading as much as I could. And I, really kind of stumbled into the MLS world and understood that there were some issues there. First, from a fragmentation, really decentralization standpoint, which has its own beauty, but also the struggles from a tech founder. I'm looking at this industry that is the biggest in the world, most
Right.
net worth in the world, most valuable database in the world. If you were to ever combine all the MLSs into a single database, it's the most valuable tech product on the planet at that point. And I'm sitting there
Absolutely.
and I'm like, how is this fragmented and decentralized? And then I got into what I said earlier, there's a beauty to it. It keeps it local, it keeps it niche, which is what on the ground you want. But from your
Right.
perspective and my perspective, that's not what we want. Um, from
No,
a
that's a scalability concern.
for sure.
Right.
And so I was like, oh man, this is probably a shit show. I need to learn more about this, because if we're going to scale Simba, that data that lives in the MLS is relevant to us, and I've got to learn more about this. And that was kind of the aha moment when I realized that there were massive, decentralization and fragmentation problems. That was kind of the aha moment for me. I just kind of personally was doing my research. Another aha moment for me on, this MLS landscape is a mess, was with my first reso. A couple of things I noticed was they put up a chart on the presentation that was how many web APIs were being used in the industry, and it was like 25% penetration.
Wow.
I'm like, oh no. And then another thing, just on my personal end, I was 26 and I was by far the youngest person in the room. And, if you're an innovative industry, I shouldn't have been that much younger than everybody.
Right.
Um, and that's not necessarily an ageist or a kind of a knock on the space. It's just more of we need more young people, because that's who's on the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of, these
Absolutely.
developer focused companies like Stripe. They're founded by 19, 20 year olds. So who's going to be that
Hmm.
in the real estate space? Those are kind of the first, I would say 3 oh shit moments for me when I realized what I was getting myself into in this industry. What were some of those for you?
I mean, very much the same, I think. I think that when I learned, okay, yeah, I think it goes beyond fragmentation for me. It was more, right, beyond fragmentation. Yes, there, 20 some or however many APIs that are out there. Um, but it was the fact that, one MLS could be, have multiple vendors, right? There were, also all these ancillary data sharing agreements and things of that nature. And it it just creates this very complex web that you really need to untangle, right? And I think untangling that takes a long time. And um, if only, right, we had met Bill earlier, because that means I would have met David Gumper earlier. I mean, he, in just the first hour, that I met him, I mean, my knowledge went from here to here, you know, and, we talk on a weekly basis at this point. Like, we've been, running at this here for a little while, but in the early days, that was definitely an oh shit moment of like, wait, how does this MLS have multiple vendors? They have however many APIs associated, right, with this particular area. All these APIs serve different purposes to a certain extent, right? They're not just mirror representations, of one another. The uh, this MLS, right, has 60 custom fields. This MLS has 10. Like, why the disparity? Shouldn't there be more, more overlap, right, in terms of that data schema, the field mappings? I mean, it can range pretty wildly. So, that was a huge oh shit moment, right? So you mentioned the data standardization, and luckily, right, we are progressing in that direction. There's been more consolidation, more data standardization, I believe in the past, 2 years than there's been in the past 20.
Yeah, for sure.
So
Yeah, that's a large part thanks to RISO, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But
Eh,
to your
Yep.
point of the integrations and the APIs not lining up, custom fields, things of that nature, it gets back to this problem of real estate's local. It's localized data, localized. This
And
is
for a
not the right
reason.
word. Yeah, for this is not the
Right.
right word, but local slang on, what words do you call a front porch, or what words do you call these
Correct.
different aspects of a home? There's localization even to how you categorize and name
Yep.
these fields. That's frustrating, but there's also an issue that is kind of a leading indicator of these API problems, and it's bureaucracy.
Hmm.
It's a very bureaucratic industry. It's almost like a government. There's a lot of
Oh
layers,
yeah.
a lot of approvals that need to happen just to get access to certain things, to get conversations with certain people. And I think for us, we've been frustrated with that. And what's your perspective been on kind of the bureaucracy? And as a upcoming founder that might be listening to this, where do you cut that cake first to get to right in the center where you need to be?
Right. I mean, again, I think that that's another piece of this that, I mean, and I would consider that an oh shit moment, is when, you realize this is very bureaucratic. Just because I spoke to the, CEO, that, that, that doesn't mean that was the right person to talk to. Right. Because that's the other side of this is, okay, there is this bureaucracy in place. Um, you know, you can't look at it with all right, we're going to go top down. We're going to hit, the CEO. He's the decision maker. That's not the case, and maybe he doesn't even deal with tech integrations, right? I mean, and ultimately they're going to have to go to their board and get that approval. So I think one of the biggest, where do you slice the cake? You have to find a resource, right, that knows these organizations, whether it's just that organization specifically, or multiple, which is even better. You need to understand, all right, who do I need to talk to? Where do I begin this conversation? Because that is the difference between, getting from point A to point B, in a short amount of time, or it could be, months and months and months and months and months,
Yeah.
right?
So Bill Fowler for us was kind of that first kind of domino to
You got it.
fall. One thing I've noticed, and this comes back to the empathy earlier that we were talking about with MLS execs. You said going to the CEO is not necessarily the best first move. I got very firsthand experience with this. I'd get
Hmm.
in great touch with an MLS executive or an association
Right.
executive, show them what we're doing, eyes pop open. Oh shit, this is an amazing platform. We're in.
Yep.
Verbal commitment. We're moving
Oh
forward.
yeah.
Then crickets.
Yep.
Just nothing. And months go
Classic.
by and you're sitting there wondering what you did wrong, wondering how you get back into their conversation. And it's frustrating because we've only got so much runway. We've got this is mission critical for us to get into these
Right.
MLSs, get the distribution to their brokers and agents that we want to solve their members' problems, but also to get these integrations. That was one of the most frustrating parts of the kind of bureaucracy that I noticed was, even if you get to who is perceived as the top of that pyramid of the bureaucracy, it doesn't mean anything necessarily. That
No,
was a
they can
big
love
learning
everything
lesson.
about what you're doing.
And
Right.
if I had advice for founders breaking into this bureaucracy, it's hit up as many different stakeholders as you can simultaneously. The CEO, go to their
Yes.
website and find members of their board. If they have an agent task force, figure out all those agents and
Find a
reach out to them
strat
cold.
plan.
Find a strat plan. There's all these
Yeah.
angles you have to hit simultaneously, and it's a lot. And that would be my advice: is there's layers to it. They're just you got to address that. You can't get around it.
Yep.
So figure out how do you touch all the layers in a way that's going to get you in the door. Um,
Right. That's meaningful. Exactly.
so the example here was for me and Simba was Chicago. Reached out cold to the members of their team about NAR Reach. They had a program for NAR Reach. Reached out cold to their team. Hey, can we participate in this? We're doing amazing things. Can I give you a demo? They said yes, uh, and got the demo. Loved it. Then we got into their executive team. Gave another demo. The executive team was all in. Verbal commit. So at this point, I already had some built up pain on the verbal commitments. I didn't really take that too seriously. And I said, what's next? Like, tell me what I need to do next. And it was talking to their agent task force, which was similar to what a board might be on new technology. Gave them a demo, drove up from Kentucky to Chicago in person, gave them that demo in person. Task force was ready to move forward. They loved it. We were solving a big problem. And then a month later, we kicked off their annual event in person, had a few hundred people in the crowd. We were up on stage showing our solution, and that one went very fast. But that was probably the 10th MLS, and I had a better cadence of, I need to talk to this person. Tell me what's next. Give me all the checklist items before you go cold on me,
Right.
and then I hit those. And that, I think, is what founders need to understand is the second you get into MLS, you need to ask them, tell me everything I need to do to get in the door if this is going to work.
Well, and yeah, tell me everything I need to do. And are there any other avenues, right, for getting in the door? Because, I think what a lot of, maybe first time founders would not understand is that there are multiple ways to get into the MLS, right? Now it depends on your strategy, your product, who you're targeting, but there are multiple ways to do that, and that's not always clear.
Yeah, for sure. And as we get towards the end of this and kind of the meat of the conversation here, which is where you play so heavily data standardization. I had my eyes open to this at Reso. I didn't realize it was such a problem. I figured that the decentralization across the markets was one of the larger problems, but as part of that, a downstream effect of that is these different regions have different databases, different structures, different, again, lingo or words that they classify as part of their fields. Give us an inside look
Yep.
into what that is, because you all are deeply ingrained in that just because of the nature of your product. That's a big question because there's so much to touch on there. But what's the most important part of the data standardization that somebody listening to this podcast needs to understand?
Well, I mean, I think that, in industry-wide insights are typically, reported a year right later. That's because we have to extrapolate so much from all of these different data sources, right, that completely differ from one another. And when I say that, it's, all of these organizations have been, siloed prior to the digital age, right? So, field names, right? Property type, all these things that would seem obvious, really aren't, because you can have fields that mean the same thing that are, labeled completely differently from MLS to MLS. So in terms of, what's important to note about data standardization, I mean, it's just the ability to gain insights, the ability to be able to, to forecast, to be able to extrapolate, any value. You have to have uniform data across the industry, and we're getting that. I think the industry is certainly moving in that direction. Will we ever completely have a uniform, completely standardized data set across all MLSs? No, because there are reasons for, specific customizations and fields based on, your region, your location. That's totally understandable, but I think there needs to be, an agreement on, these are the required fields, these are what they're named, because then everything can work synergistically with one another. I think, at this point, there is a lot of hacks that go on, that are then, buried by, a new technology, a new way to do something, but they still are wrapped up in these legacy systems. So there's just a lot of unpacking and a lot of technical debt as a result.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, for sure. And have you found, I don't know the answer for this, but have you found that some MLSs just don't have the incentive to standardize their data for alternative reasons? Are there reasons locally whether for their own revenue's sake, for their own just comfort? Are there incentives that are misaligned here to standardize data as quick as possible, or do you think that there are, aligned incentives that the whole industry needs to get there as soon as possible?
I think that, I think for some that there's definitely there's incentive there. And I think more and more, MLSs, definitely see the importance of that. Now, on the other side, right, you know, they they have existing policy, right, that they have to adhere to. That policy may lend itself, right, to certain decisions on the data side or certain rules that are embedded in the system that's not easy to just gut out, right? Especially when you might not even know the rules that are embedded in the system. It's like there was a lot of intent behind the policy that was created over decades and decades, so it's a slow unraveling and it's very meticulous. And I think that MLSs are more and more each day see the importance of that, because it's limiting them, it's limiting their members' access and their brokers' access to innovative technology. Um, and now more than ever, right, brokers are pounding the table saying, we want innovative technology. Why can't we use something that's far superior, right, to the existing, system? It makes no sense. I mean, um, it, I think brokers are finally getting what they've asked for so many years. That the minds of many MLSs are changing, which is great. It's going to take time. Evan, I can't hear you, dude.
Sorry, I muted myself. So give
Oh, you're
your
good.
give your insight to that data standardization and how Ocusell fits in. Where do you guys bring value there, and how do you help that going forward in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, so every MLS that we're integrated with, we, map it to really a common data model. Um, so in terms of data standardization, I think that, regardless of what, an MLS decides to do, we can ultimately, decipher that data and put it into a common data model. That way, look, like, it's not necessarily on the MLS to completely overhaul, right, their schema. We can do it on our side. We can provide them with the insights, and the value that comes with, more or less a standardized data model or data footprint. And that we work pretty closely, with RISO, just in terms of, right, the way that we're building it, the way that we're doing it, the model that we've created, because they're a great resource. So I mean, and that's kind of just back to a way earlier question. I encourage new founders to join associations like RISO on day one. You know, like, look to see what's out there on day one. I didn't mean it ever from
No,
the
that's
current
great. Yeah,
question, but
that's great advice. Because if I could go back and the day I started Simba, go to a RISO event, I learned more at RISO than I could have ever imagined. And again, that's the role of this podcast. Is we
right.
shouldn't have to go to a RISO to learn as much as we did. We shouldn't
I
have to
know.
travel across the country to get that information and just have some basic level of understanding. I mean, I felt like the stuff looking back in hindsight that I learned at RISO, while at the time was eye opening, it feels like very basic foundational understanding, and that's
Yes.
frustrating.
Yes, it's frustrating, and thank God for RISO. I mean, it's been a catalyst for us in terms of, just directionally and, momentum wise, and they're just great folks, very open to, to working and helping, startups in this space along. Especially when, we happen to be working on something that dovetails in with that, their overall, goals, objectives, and strategies. So that helps. But great organization. I encourage any founder to, find an organization that fits their need.
Yeah. Well, man, thanks for joining. This has been fun. I look forward to more conversations. We'll be hanging out soon. I'll come up there to Cincy and we'll get some more wings and watch some football or basketball here soon. But
For sure.
these conversations are important. I'm glad you and I are having them. I'm glad we met through Bill, and I think other founders, MLS executives. I think they're going to find this kind of conversation valuable, and we got to keep doing it. So appreciate you joining, man.
Absolutely, man. It was my pleasure. I'll see you soon, buddy.
Yep.